Hello everyone. This video will review Chapter 10 in your text, Single Subject Designs. So what are single subject designs? Well, as the name suggests, they are research studies that analyze data based on individuals rather than groups. And so we say these are practice-oriented designs because they're ideal for social workers to use in practice to assess the efficacy of the interventions they use to work with their clients. In fact, this type of design is really used much more by social work practitioners than researchers. We use single subject designs when we want to find out whether or not a client is experiencing change due to a treatment intervention. And so many times we're looking to help clients improve things like depression, anxiety, or behavioral issues. These variables are called targets of change. And so we have to be sure that we can measure these variables. So as we discussed in previous classes, we must develop an operational definition for the targets of change so that they can be measured. It's also important to know that in single subject designs, the target of change should be something the practitioner has control over, not subject to some outside intervention. For example, if a depressed person is being treated by psychiatrists with medication, that would be beyond the social worker's influence. So just a quick review on the research process to put single subject design into context. Remember that researchers need to have these questions answered in order to conduct any study. They need to determine the time frame, define the variables, decide how the variables need to be measured, and then determine if there are other variables that could influence outcome that need to be accounted for or controlled for. The researcher also needs to decide who the data will be collected from. For example, who is the participant? They also need to determine when it should be collected, how it will be analyzed, and how they're going to disseminate or share the results with others. One term to remember is units of analysis. A unit of analysis is simply the thing that you're studying. If you're studying people, the unit of analysis is people. If you're analyzing documents, then the units of analysis are the words in the document or the text in the document. Next, we will review the requirements for conducting single subject designs, and there are 5 listed on this slide. First, the target problem or target of change needs to be clearly stated. The researcher must be specific. Vague descriptions of the problem will not suffice. So, for example, a vague target problem description is the client is not sleeping well. To make this more specific, the problem could be more specifically stated. The client awakes after 2 to 3 hours of sleep and then cannot fall back asleep. Second, the outcome or dependent variable needs to be identified and defined. What do you want the outcome to be? Again, the dependent variable must be specific and measurable. On this slide, we see how a general dependent variable is made more specific. Instead of stating the client will be able to sleep through the night, which is rather general, we state the client will be able to sleep 7 hours continuously throughout the night. Third, we define the intervention or treatment, which we know is the independent variable. In this case, we are going to use a recording of a guided relaxation exercise as the intervention. We can be more specific, for example, by stating that the relaxation intervention lasts 30 minutes. So again, just like the dependent variable needs to be measured, so does the independent variable. You have to know how much of a particular intervention you're administering. Fourth, we need to select valid and reliable outcome measures. In this case, we're simply measuring the number of hours the client is able to continuously sleep through the night. But in other studies, for example, if we're trying to help a client decrease depression, a valid and reliable measure might be scores on the Beck Depression Inventory. And that, if you recall, we looked at the Beck Depression Inventory in class. Fifth, in single subject designs, we always create graphic representation of the data. And one of your exercises this week will be to chart some single subject design data. And how the data are displayed depends on the type of single subject design model. There are exploratory single subject designs, descriptive single subject designs, and explanatory single subject designs. And I will review each of the designs over the next few slides. First, though, you must know the basic notation for single subject designs. In single subject designs, we use capital letters to represent different parts of the study. So the letter A is the baseline measure. It's the point at which the client is at before any treatment begins. So we always establish a baseline if possible. It's not always possible, as I'll discuss in a few other slides. But if possible, we like to get a baseline because we like to see where the client is at before we start an intervention. The capital letter B represents the first intervention, and so this is the period that occurs after the baseline, once the treatment or intervention has begun. And then additional letters can be used too, capital C and capital D. They're not always used, but in the case where multiple different interventions are used, then each different intervention gets its own letter. So for example, if relaxation is labeled intervention B, we also might have intervention C, which could be cognitive behavioral therapy. Okay, so first let's review exploratory designs. Remember that exploratory research is conducted when we don't know much about the topic. Exploratory designs are either A, which is the baseline only, and this gives us information about the problem. So in that sense, it's exploratory. We have a B design, which would be when we're recording or monitoring the intervention only, and this gives us information about what happens when the intervention is taking place. And then there are two other variants that we won't go into too much detail, but BB1 and BC. So BB1 is when there are two separate measures of the same intervention recorded at different times, and BC would be two separate measures of two different interventions. Here's an example of A intervention only, and this is the number of hours of continuous sleep the person has before they start the treatment. So in this case, we can see where the person is at when they're coming into treatment, but we don't know anything about what's going on with them after they actually will be starting the intervention. This is just a view of the baseline. So again, it's exploratory and it gives us information. The next slide is an example of B only. And this is the number of hours of continuous sleep the person has after they start the relaxation intervention. And so neither A only or B only really give us a full picture of what is going on with the person. We get pieces of them. So we are getting information, we're exploring the issue, but we can improve our designs a bit if we want to by using a descriptive design. And descriptive designs include AB, ABC, and ABCD. Remember that A stands for baseline and B, C, and D stand for different interventions. Here's an example of an AB design, and we see that we're now tracking or measuring both the baseline period, which would be the A period, and the intervention period, which would be B. And this helps us see the before and during periods of our work with the client. If we have different interventions, we can expand this further to an ABC design. So in other words, A would be the baseline, B would be your first intervention, and C would be your second intervention. And in that case, you would just see another section added to this chart labeled C. Notice that the descriptive designs, although they give us more information, don't really tell us if the effects of the intervention will be sustained after the treatment stops. And to know that, we need to use an explanatory single subject design. And those are ABA, ABAB, BAB, or BCBC. And I will explain these in a moment, but please note that explanatory designs can also involve measuring more than one case, or measuring more than one setting, or measuring more than one problem. So you could look at multiple individuals with the same issue. You could look at them in different settings and record data in different settings. So for example, when we talk about continuous hour sleep, you could record data from their report at home on how many hours they sleep, but somebody could also be in a sleep lab and have their sleep monitored, or measuring more than one problem. And if you measure more than one problem, then you can see how the intervention affects one problem compared to another. So many times people don't simply just have one issue they're dealing with, they might have multiple issues they're dealing with. So an example of an ABA design is shown on this slide, and we see that A shows us the number of hours the person continuously slept before the intervention. B shows us the number of hours the person continuously slept during the intervention while the intervention was being applied. In other words, they were listening to the relaxation recording. And then A shows us the second baseline, so the number of hours the person continuously slept after the intervention was discontinued. And notice that this gives us a fuller cause and effect picture. On this next slide, then, we see a slight variation of ABA, and this is the BAB design. And this is when the intervention is measured first, so that's labeled with the number B, with the letter B, and followed by the baseline measure, which is labeled with the letter A, and then followed again by another intervention, the same intervention, letter B. And sometimes we do this because we can't get a baseline when a person comes into treatment because they're distressed and they can't wait for help. So we don't have time to collect a baseline. We want to help the person right away. We can't say to a depressed person, well, okay, I want to help you, but I want to measure your depression for a week before we start treatment to get a baseline. That would be unethical and it wouldn't be very nice. So the BAB gives us the full picture without making a person wait for the intervention. So you might ask, well, why don't we just ask the person how many hours they slept per night before coming in for treatment, and that way we could get a baseline. We could, but people's memories are not reliable, and therefore we really should not put too much stock in what a person's memory is of something. So if somebody comes in for treatment and we ask them to recall things, they're upset, they're stressed. If it's a sleep problem, for example, or depression, they may not be recalling things correctly. So it's really not a good idea to get a baseline just from memory. There are some concerns about using single subject designs. First, they may not always be practical. Second, they're limited. The charts don't take into account other variables. And likewise, the validity may be limited. We don't know if we're really measuring what we want to measure. And because we rely on time series measurements, we may not have enough time to establish baselines in treatment phases. For example, a person might not follow through on tracking their sleep, or maybe they'll drop out of treatment for a while. And of course, single subject designs are individually focused, so we really can't generalize anything from these to a larger population. Because of this, there's limited research on the effectiveness of single subject designs. But again, the focus of single subject design isn't necessarily to generalize to a larger population. It's really to monitor the progress of one person, which is why it's suited for social work practitioners. So what do you think? Do you think that single subject designs are helpful tools for social workers to use? And finally, there are also ethical issues. As mentioned, it may not be ethical to collect baseline data because it means the person would need to wait to get the intervention. Also, in the BAB method, where we start out with the intervention, you can see that there's a period of time that the intervention is withdrawn to see how the effect lasts. So we have the B and then the A when the intervention is withdrawn. We're going to get this baseline after the first treatment, and then we start up the treatment again. So we need to know whether or not that is really in the client's best interest. Another ethical issue is whether the researcher can or should also be the client's therapist. This is called a dual relationship, and this is generally discouraged by the social worker's code of ethics. So one workaround to this is to have someone else conduct the single subject design on your client, record the data, and then you just strictly provide the intervention. And also because this is research, really the client should be giving informed consent, and perhaps the study should also possibly be going through an IRB to make sure the person is protected. And that's particularly important if the information is going to be disseminated. And as stated earlier, one of the goals of the research process, or one of the steps in the research project, is to share information. So if we study something, it is helpful to other practitioners if we can share it with them, but it may not always be ethical or possible. Okay, so that's the end of our review on Chapter 10, Single Subject Designs. In the email that contained the link to this video, I have some tasks for you to do. There should be an attached document that has the list of things that you're going to need to do. It's not a long list, but there are some things that you'll need to do for your assignments this week. One of them will be to review some single subject design data and create a graphical representation of that data, and that's explained in the document. And then there may be another exercise where you will be posting to the message board, the discussion board this week. So carefully review the assignments this week and make sure that you get them into me before our next class period. And if you have any questions whatsoever, please give me a call or send me an email. I'd be happy to speak with you.